A warm welcome to this discussion on resilient pathways to climate neutrality, lessons from member states' long-term climate strategies. My name is Matthias Duwe. I'm the head of the climate team at Ecologic Institute, which is a Berlin-based think tank on environmental policy. I have both the pleasure and the privilege to be guiding us all through the next hour and a half, as we will hear insights from the first ever comparative assessment of national long-term strategies in EU member states and discuss the results and the recommendations drawn from the basis of this analysis with experts and with the audience. We will start this conversation with introductory words on the motivation for doing this analysis from Erica Hope from the European Climate Foundation. She's head of the program for climate laws and planning at ECF, and it is at her suggestion and with the funding from ECF that Ecologic Institute has carried out this work. We will then hear a brief video message from Laurence Tubiana, who is the CEO of the European Climate Foundation and also one of the architects of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement specifically having included the issue of long-term strategies. Following this message, there are two colleagues of mine that will present the analysis to you. They are the lead authors, Eike Felten and Nick Evans. And after that presentation, we will open it up and turn to a trio of experts that we have invited to provide their feedback and their thoughts. And there we have two representatives from member states that have both been involved in their respective national planning processes. They are Gwenaël Podesta, who is deputy head of the emissions projections and modeling department at the Ministry of Ecological Transition in France. And then there is Katarina Čestenjak, who is a researcher at the Josef Stefan Institute in Slovenia and was very closely involved in the project that shaped and helped bring about the Slovenian LTS. And then, last but not least, we have Alban Kitos, who's a policy officer at the Unit for Foresight, Economic Analysis and Modeling at DG Klima in the European Commission. That is the unit under whose purview the national long-term strategies fall. And we are, of course, in addition, looking for input and questions from you. And so I would invite all of the participants to please use the Q&A feature that we have in this webinar to pose your questions. They can be upvoted if you like a question that somebody else has already posted. And needless to say, where these are more of a technical nature and relate maybe to aspects of the analysis of the presentation, we may try to answer those in writing, but others that are more for discussion or comments on the political dimension of it, we may take to the panel and insert them into the conversation. So much for our program for the coming hour and a half. And with this, I hand over to Erica.
Thanks very much, Matthias, and a pleasure to be here today for the unveiling of this, I think, extremely important report, which also feels especially timely given we have the COP this week. I expect we all heard the message from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the start of the week that humanity is on a highway to climate hell. I think we've all seen the language getting harder and harder as the urgency of the climate crisis progresses. And frankly, to continue with the metaphor, countries need a roadmap to get off this highway and to choose a path to a habitable planet. It's not less important than that. And national long-term strategies are key to creating that roadmap. And this is a view that at ECF, and I think Ecologic, we've shared for a long time, that the long-term strategies and long-term dimension of climate planning is extremely important because you need to understand the integrated way that the economy is going to get towards net zero. And in light of that, you have to understand what do we need to do today in light of this understanding in order to be on the right track to make sure that other sectors can fulfill their parts of the puzzle. You know, how much renewables do we need to generate the green hydrogen that other sectors are counting on, and can other sectors rely on that? And where might additional efforts be most strongly needed in order to deliver the technologies or practices that one or more sectors are counting on? And also, are developments in the real economy matching up to the sorts of pathways that we think that we need to see? So, it seems very obvious that net zero is not going to be arrived at by chance. To arrive at a destination, you do need a map, particularly when the terrain is as complicated as steering a whole economy onto a net zero course. And this is why countries and regions need these robust long-term strategies with a clear articulation of the pathways needed in each sector and how they interact. Now, this importance of long-term strategies is a view that is evidently shared by the UN high-level group. You might have seen that just on Tuesday, they published their report on net zero integrity, and its recommendations were focused on corporates and on non-state actors, but they do apply equally to states. And the report calls for several things, but in particular for transition plans that should be updated every 5 years and should be in line with modelled pathways that will limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, reaching net zero by 2050 or sooner. So it's there in the high-level group's report, it's there in the Paris Agreement, the need for long-term strategies. And I mentioned this question of long-term climate planning is something that Ecologic, ECF and a number of other actors and institutions have been working on for several years to promote the importance of long-term climate planning. And this included making the case for the long-term strategies to be included in the governance regulations so that it is a requirement for member states to produce that. And most of the member states have obviously done a first go at that, and the report that we're going to hear about today is a first, I think, in looking at how well the member states and the EU Commission have engaged with that planning framework. And there's been, I think, noticeably less emphasis on the long-term strategies than the National Energy and Climate Plans so far. Of course, the National Energy and Climate Plans are absolutely crucial, but in particular, they need to be developed in synergy with the long-term strategies. The policies and choices that are made now need to be consistent with those long-term pathways, and for that we need a clear view of what the long-term pathways are. And so today, I think I'm really looking forward to hearing what's in the report in terms of the assessment of what's actually in the content of the long-term strategies, but also the findings from the work that was done around the analytical sort of looking at the reports. The report has been developed with a lot of interviews and things, I think, of people who've been involved in preparing these to see how well they have or how the process went and how well they have affected national policy making and what potential they see. And I know the panel who are here today will have lots of really interesting insights on that as well. So very much looking forward to hearing the contents, and thank you again for the work and for the session today.
Thank you very much indeed, Erica, and thank you for providing the initial impulse that triggered all of this. And well, with that, I think we're handing it over to Eike Felten, who is going to start off the presentation. There was a whole team of colleagues involved. Yes.
We have first the video.
Oh, of course we do. Thank you so much for the reminder. Of course, so before we jump to the presentation, of course, we do want to hear the message from Laurence Toubiana, who is CEO of the European Climate Foundation.
I'm very sorry not to be with you for the very good launch of this new report done by Ecologic. Was it the first in-depth report of EU member state long-term strategies? And why it is really important to tackle this issue now is that because it's a very clear picture, even though 20 out of the EU 27 countries have identified a net zero goal as a national objective, but more European LTS long-term strategies lack a whole-of-society approach and to achieve really the net zero. And some even long-term strategies are already totally outdated. It's because of such failure to properly plan the transition that we find ourselves so vulnerable to the energy crisis today. And it's an important moment to dwell upon this crisis and to see how much a mistake we did, not in a way anticipating the change we have to make rapidly, and in a way that the really excruciating situation in where we are today in Europe. While the EU is to be congratulated for embracing the process of the long-term strategy within its climate policy architecture, which is good, and it's not everyone in the world who has done that, this report shows that the US states urgently need to do, updating their long-term strategy with clear pathways and milestones to the net zero by 2050, but even more, create the domestic capacity to guide their implementation. And there is a way to do this through the national energy and climate plans. This can inform the road to 2030 and make this road consistent with the 2050 goal. Without this milestone, and 2030 is a crucial one, we have said minus 55% for all EU, and that of course represent different objectives for the different countries, but it's now almost less than 8 years now to deliver that. And if you don't have a clear plan for 2030 target, you will not be able to deliver anything serious on 2050. And that's why it's impossible if the member states don't articulate their domestic policies to see if they are ambitious enough to reach the net zero goals they have committed to. And that's essential to stay in line with the Paris Agreement and even the recent commitment made in Glasgow last year. Under the EU climate law, the European Commission will also need to rely on the information and the processes through the national energy and climate plans and the national long-term strategy to assess where EU is for real, not in theory. And here too, the report shows that the Commission can do much more to push member states to refresh these long-term strategies as soon as possible and not until the end of the decade. It will be, again, far too late. For this process to be owned by EU countries, the Commission should provide a forum for good practices, technical exchanges, just to exchange on the governance aspect in particular, so that member states are encouraged and help to refresh their long-term strategy very quickly and to embody them in their climate law. Ultimately, the EU member state, for owning this process, it means that citizens would have to have a say at that. And with this report show above all is that there are only benefits to include and embark citizens in this journey. The bottom-up approach and the mix with the top-down approach was the particular flavor what made the Paris Agreement possible and successful. And that the same energy which is needed, embarking the citizen for all the climate planning today. And when we do most of the polls in all European countries, you see that most citizens are ready and are wanting strong regulation, strong national plans. And there is no miracle, no top-down decision-making can make these deep changes happen. So it is through the ownership and the involvement of civil society, of the citizens themselves, that you can deliver on this very ambitious plan to reduce emission by 2030 and on the longer term. So this report is very important and essential, and it shows that we have a lot of job to deliver before 2030.
Together with Erica's input and now Laurence's message, I think we've got a very good framing from the top level of discussions at the COP on implementation of the Paris Agreement, where the call for these strategies emanates from and going down to the bottom-up involvement of civil society and citizens in national climate policy that provides, I think, a good framework for us to now indeed go to the presentation on the results of the analysis. And there was a whole team involved, but here are the two people who've done most of the writing, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Eike and Nick. Take it away.
Thank you, Matthias. So let me start screen sharing. I hope you can all see the presentation. Great. So I'm very happy to be here today and to be able to present our key findings together with my colleague Nick. So I have to thank ECF for their encouragement and support, in particular also the team at Ecologic that helped us making this happen, and partners from Wise Europa, from the Joseph Stefan Institute, and from the Swedish Environment Institute Tallinn, contributing to this assessment. So the scope of our work was to extract, assess, and compare the information from the existing long-term strategies. By the time of writing, this was 22. 5 were missing, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Ireland, Poland, and Romania. In the meantime, we have Cyprus with a submitted strategy, so that is not included. We aimed at identifying good practice examples in terms of the information provision and in terms of ambition. We used different examples to better understand what actually makes a good LTS, and then we derived overarching conclusions and recommendations to make suggestions for improving any upcoming strategies and the related processes. We started our analysis by identifying what a good LTS needs. This builds on the governance regulation, which has a few mandatory elements and a voluntary annex. We also use past work of us and of others, such as IDRI, Can Europe, or the World Research Institute. We can see here a selection in this visual, and includes elements like sectoral information, the technologies, lifestyle change, the value of nature, just transition, and finance aspects. We also found that it needs a good basis. So this includes, for example, participation in the developing of an LTS, as well as scientific inputs and scenarios. The objective was to look at 2 different qualities. So we looked at the long-term vision that is outlined in the strategies. So this is about the countries envisaging how they actually envisaging their net zero future and how they want to get there, and what are the key enablers to drive the transition. And we also assessed the relevance of the long-term strategies in a national context. And here we focused on the preparation process, follow-up, and integration of the strategies to better understand the impact of the document. The visuals you can see here actually try to capture what we understand to be relevant. And a big thanks goes to the designer of Novel Studio in this case, because they made it happen to put our thinking into visuals. Our assessment was based almost solely on the long-term strategies. So we considered some external documents, but generally we thought that the long-term strategies should speak for themselves. We assessed the strategies based on an analytical framework. It basically consists of different categories. So here you can see the long-term targets and sectoral elements. Then in these categories, we had different dimensions. So for example, energy demand. And in each dimension, we use criteria to structure the information collection. So for energy demand, we had a look at the primary energy consumption, final energy consumption, as well as emission reduction in each of the energy consuming sectors. The report outlines the findings structured along the categories and dimensions. And for each of the dimensions, we actually followed the same basic structure. So we first have a short introduction about the relevance of the topic. Then we have a section about the information that we found across the long-term strategies, and finally a short summary. And in the information section, we always try to condense the information into tables. In many cases, this is qualitative and quantitative information. We complemented our analysis with expert interviews in 8 countries. This was particularly to better understand the relevance of the documents, because it wasn't easy to get that information out of the strategies themselves. So now coming to the results for the 2 qualities, vision and relevance. And in fact, we could present each single item for about half an hour or so. So today we give you a short intro or a short overview of some particular elements in more detail. So I start with the long-term vision. And here we think that long-term strategies should guide countries on their way to climate neutrality. This needs a picture of the net zero future and how actually countries want to get there. There are different solutions to consider, to make available in time, and to complement on different scales. And this differs from country to country. So the long-term strategies should highlight what a country considers as their way to providing the basis for policy decisions today and in the near term, and also considering thereby specific lead times for implementation and impact. For the assessment, we looked at 4 elements, which you can see here. So this is the long-term climate targets, including the net zero year, GHG emission reduction and pathways. Sectoral elements included energy supply, demand, agriculture, and GHG removal. Hydrogen biomass and CCUS, so carbon capture, utilization, and storage is included in technology. And then we have the horizontal elements: behavior change, finance, just transition, and climate adaptation. Looking into one of these in more detail, so here you can see the results for the long-term climate targets. So we found there is an alignment of national targets with the EU objective of reaching climate neutrality by 2050. So with 20 strategies delivering a net zero target year. Many also have this target in a law. However, the picture is less clear when it then comes to the contributions of emission reductions and removals to achieve this respective target, and also for the related pathways. So from the 22 long-term strategies, actually only 12 provided an emission reduction estimate for the long term. Good examples included here, for example, the Netherlands and Hungary, which outlined an emission reduction of 95%. The information on removals that would balance the remaining emissions was actually only available from 10 strategies. Below in the table, you can see our examples, so good practice examples. So for example, Finland and Austria provide clear information on GHG emission reduction and removals, and they also want to achieve net zero well before 2050. When we come to specific sectoral elements, so here you can see an overview across all countries that provided numbers on the emission reduction in each of the sectors. And the table basically shows that, for example, in power generation, the reductions are going close to zero. There are also high reduction in buildings and transport across countries, and large differences actually can be found in agriculture. So here starts the range at around 20% up to 70%. And we assume this difference mainly comes from different assumptions on compensating emissions through technical and natural sinks. Another example you can see here is the fossil fuel use in 2050. And most countries do not provide a clear number, but rather statement how they see fossil fuel use in 2050. So the table is basically a combination of numbers and statements. So Lithuania, for example, wants to phase out fossil fuel and energy generation by 2045, and Luxembourg by 2050. We have statements from Portugal and Finland and France. So they want to phase out coal. Then Portugal, for example, in addition, has a phase out date for natural gas and power generation, and France and Austria want to phase out heating oils by 2050. And then we have some other, they have more a general statement that is like energy generation will be climate neutral or carbon neutral, without specifying that in all detail. In summary, our key findings from checking the vision of the strategies was that there is good practice with every country having its own recipe, but overall and across all strategies, there is actually not enough long-term vision from our point. This means we found very different strategies in terms of structure and content, and often content was limited, in particular because not all countries included quantified information. Some delivered numbers, but for scenarios that do not reach the national target. And then LTSs with numbers used actually different units, and base year varied significantly. This altogether made it actually quite challenging for us to compare and assess the information. However, overall, and as explained before, we see that national long-term targets are mostly aligned with the EU objective, but that underlying emission reduction and the GHG removal remain partly unclear. We found that energy consumption generally declines while renewables take over. We also see that there is some flexibility between agricultural emission reduction, use of CCS, and GHG removal. So for example, the strategy of Hungary shows an exceptional high emission reduction in agriculture. so that the country can achieve its 95 emission reduction goal. And Italy sees a quite significant role of CCS compared, for example, to other countries. All countries assume changes in behavior, although here the information was of mainly qualitative nature. And finally, all governments see that the transition will need additional investment, which is overall beneficial for economic growth and employment. Other benefits include positive health impacts, in particular due to better air quality, healthier dietary habits, and more active modes of transport. And now I hand over to Nick to present our findings on the relevance of strategies and conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you, Eike. I hope everyone can hear me all right. So I'll be presenting our findings on the relevance, as mentioned, of LTSs in their respective national contexts. And by relevance, what we really mean here is the use of the strategy as a tool for planning national climate action, and in some way, how seriously the country actually considered the task and took the task at hand. And so to get at this, we looked at, next slide, please. We looked at the preparation of the strategy. This includes compliance with the governance regulation requirements, as well as the scientific basis and participation elements. Follow-up to the strategy, such as implementation responsibilities, monitoring and revision. And finally, the integration of the strategy, its position within other national climate governance structures, and reference to and coherence with the medium-term plans. So it's important to note that the scope of the work done specifically on relevance did not allow us to peek under the hood of all national governance systems. Just because an aspect is not mentioned in the LTS does not mean that it does not exist. However, that said, we specifically were investigating governance structures for long-term planning, and therefore one would expect this to be found in the LTS where else. So we tried to present the information we found similarly as in the vision section, showing countries side by side. But of course, for this, it was far more highly and qualitative information. And therefore, we also relied on expert interviews to get a sense for at least 8 countries, kind of a behind the scenes look at the LTS in the general governance context specific for climate policymaking. To provide some sense of what we found on the relevance of LTSs, I'd like to zoom in first on follow-up and then on the integration component. So on to follow-up. The first key impression here regarding information in the LTSs is that there's a clear missing, there are clearly missing responsibilities. Only 1/3 of the strategies assign who is accountable for following up on the document itself. This means initial development, coordination with other government bodies, reviewing and revising the LTS, managing the public participation channels, etc. Most often this came in the form of a leading or coordinating ministry. Of course, one could argue that this role falls implicitly to the same ministry who developed the strategy in the first place. Nevertheless, some strategies divide up the roles significantly more concretely. The French, Lithuanian, and Estonian strategies, for example, in particular describe systems where sectoral duties are assigned to the various respective ministries with respect to the long-term planning. But nevertheless, strategies do not seem to be used by governments to create new institutions or processes or really assign clear roles for follow-up. In a few exceptional cases, the strategies themselves describe new monitoring and reporting systems or assign new monitoring tasks to existing institutions. So 2 examples here include the Hydrometeorological Institute in Czechia and the Interministerial Commission on Air, Climate Change and Circular Economy in Portugal, which both now have new tasks defined in the LTS for each respective country. Important to note is that the governance regulation does not require member states to use their LTS to bolster their national climate governance systems. Even so, the strategy is a national document and could serve to further operationalize long-term climate planning, especially in lieu of a framework climate law. However, from our analysis, it seems that in most member states, the LTS does not appreciably expand climate governance structures. When it comes to monitoring and LTS revision, what we term this, we call this a policy learning cycle in the report. The picture is equally vague. A quick reminder here is that the governance regulation requires 10-year updates, but encourages a review every 5 years to align more closely with the NECP cycle. Only 1/3 of the assessed countries state concretely in their LTS that they intend to follow the 5-year revision cycle. Overall, the documents are vague on the foreseen review in general and provide little to no information on methodologies or timelines. A few countries nevertheless stand out as good practice. Here, France again enshrines a pretty concrete 5-year policy learning cycle in a national law. This is based off the national strategy that pre-existed, national strategy cycle, long-term strategy cycle that pre-existed the governance regulation. And this is also based on a dynamic evaluation rubric and expert consultation. Both Estonia and Malta have similar review cycles that they describe in the LTS. Nevertheless, albeit for Estonia, it's for a shorter term time horizon, only for 2030. Next slide, please. Moving on to integration. This is more or less getting at the weight of the LTS in a national governance context. And it was quite difficult to gauge, of course, from the documents themselves, and the interviews provided significantly more insights. First of all, it seems that countries they use their LTSs as a means to compile all current and planned climate actions and more or less describe this and submit this to the European Union. For instance, Czechia, Hungary, and Latvia all describe in varying detail how their respective strategies relate to other sectoral or national planning processes, and do this in a bit more detail than compared to others. Good practice, however, can be found in France, Malta, Portugal, and Spain, where the LTS describes how it's featured concretely as the long-term planning tool in a national climate framework law, which of course is a separate regulation altogether, and it is more or less the anchored, therefore, in national governance structures more concretely. When it comes to NECP LTS coherence, a full quantitative evaluation of this is absolutely necessary. It was beyond the scope of this report. Again, we did not consult the NECPs in any significant detail. However, for the most part, at least what's described in the LTSs, most documents take note of the requirement for coherence between the short and long-term planning horizons and insist that this is the case, that the documents were developed in tandem, that there was coordination. However, as a proxy for a full analysis, we just considered full criteria, the timing of submission, common methodologies between the two documents, referencing between the two, and of course, and last but not least, common ministerial oversight. Next slide, please. Just to give a sense on the ministerial oversight piece, it's particularly interesting because perhaps surprisingly, it seems that the two documents were not always prepared by the same ministry. Many countries divided up responsibilities between 2 or even more, 3, 4 ministries. For instance, oftentimes between the economy and in energy, and then the environment ministry doing the long-term perspective. Given the sometimes conflicting priorities between these different realms of, in terms of policymakers working in these different realms, it could undermine the cohesiveness of short and long-term planning overall, unless there are clear lines of interministerial communication and coordination. Next slide, please. So to sum up, key findings for the relevance portion of the report: good practices exist, and it is clear that simply the act of developing a strategy can have a positive effect on climate governance, whether this is further mainstreaming of climate action by expanding the burden of responsibility, additional stakeholder and public involvement, transparency over long-term processes, or even in a few exceptional cases, the creation of new processes and institutions. However, in many cases, it seemed to be a box-checking exercise, and participatory processes were often lacking in depth, or at least the information on these was lacking in depth, and representation could have been better implemented. LTS updating and progress monitoring does not seem to be a priority. In general, long-term progress monitoring does not seem to be a priority. And there's also a lack of clear follow-up responsibilities on the documents themselves. NECP LTS alignment exists on paper, but some things, such as the timing of the development, given also the tardiness of many of these LTSs themselves in general, and the fact that 4 are still outstanding, and who is responsible, suggests there's reason to be dubious about the statements in the documents themselves. We use the image of a map throughout the reports, and of course, Erica brought this up again at this top to reiterate the importance of seeing these strategies as governance tools. They should be dynamic blueprints that set a course, revised, discussed, updated entirely by design. If you take this as the ideal starting point, the overarching message arising from our assessment of relevance is that the LTSs are significantly underutilized in national policymaking in most cases. So next slide, please. To try to round everything out, conclusions for both vision and relevance, it's clear that good practices exist. France, Spain, and Portugal stand out in the group. All 3 of these strategies provide good information on their long-term vision, including details on total and sectoral greenhouse gas emission reductions, and at least to some extent on the use of hydrogen, biomass, CCUS, sinks, and therefore give a good sense of where they see the country headed for 2050. These three also embed their LTS as the long-term planning element of a national climate framework law with regular cycles of review, and describe more robust participatory and stakeholder engagement processes, and also plans for future stakeholder engagement and participatory processes that go over and above the requirements in the governance regulation. However, most others, LTSs, lack significant detail and seem to be disconnected from national climate policymaking. This could come down to the lack of guidance and emphasis from the EU level, and maybe a disproportionate emphasis on the medium term. In the end, these, of course, are EU obligated planning tools. And therefore, coming to our recommendations, the first and foremost would be, next slide, please, would be in the context of the governance regulation. The most critical recommendation is that the governance regulation should be revised to include a mandatory template. Currently, this is in the annex, it's a suggested template that is quite meager, and certainly compared to the NECP template. This should ask countries to provide greater detail, because we've seen the LTSs are lacking information on their long-term vision, and these are also in no way harmonized, making it very difficult, as we experienced firsthand, to assess and compare these, which is something that, of course, the Commission is going to need to do. The governance regulation should also be revised to require a more frequent update. So as I said, 10 years is the current required update with a 5-year suggested update. But given the timing of development, it is far from certain that the strategies are actually in line with NECPs. Many came after the NECPs, which is not the ideal. You want to, of course, set your goals in advance and then come up with the intermediate actions to get there. So, and in addition to that, many are already out of date, making them unusable for current planning needs. The importance of participation was reflected by Dr. Tubiana at the start. It's also, of course, reflected in Article 10 of the governance regulation and in the multi-level dialogues. But from our assessment, it seems that member states did a lackluster job on this, or at least certainly many did. From what we could tell, only 4 member states describe consultations at 2 stages in LTS development, such as before and after a draft document is available, which we would consider a bare minimum to allow for effective consultation with the public and also, of course, stakeholder groups. The governance regulation should therefore strongly encourage more effective consultations, and it remains to be seen, however, to what extent the multi-level dialogues may be used for this purpose. When it comes to national governance, these also have a role to play, not only on participation, but when it comes, the LTSs are highly technical by nature, and thus we recommend that countries should also engage in some form of peer review process or expert opinion. Perhaps surprisingly, this did not seem to be the case, or at least this could have happened way more behind the scenes than it was for us able to tease out. But this should draw on existing expert bodies where possible. Ideally, a national climate advisory body, such as the Climate Council, would have a dedicated role in LTS development, even if only to check the assumptions and underlying scenarios that put forward by the government. We're aware that many of such councils there are coming into existence and came into existence after or in the middle of the LTS development process. So this is something that we would hope to see significantly more used in the future. National governments could also anchor and should also anchor long-term planning in governance structures more clearly by mandating a dedicated review cycle at national level for 2050 climate ambition, and also setting a date for net zero. We've seen that even countries with a net zero target do not specify how they will achieve it, often leaving out relevant detail and removals. And climate neutrality targets need to be clearly communicated so that they're taken seriously, and with concrete figures on what net zero means and when it will be achieved. Finally, on the part of the Commission, certainly not least, we see the need for further technical support and experience sharing. Given the range and quality, both on scenario building and presentation in the strategies themselves, and the range in the detail of information, it is clear that many countries would benefit from such an exchange. We're aware that there are existing avenues, but these should be expanded and continued. An ideal option would be to establish more formally institutionalized forum for dialogue for each LTS iteration. The Commission should also enforce compliance with its own rules. 4 LTSs today are still unaccounted for, almost 3 years past the deadline, which has ostensibly created delays in a Commission review of all of them. And our assessment showed that for many documents fail or barely meet the mandatory content requirements. We are of course aware of the recent announcement to commence infringement proceedings, and this is an important step, good, important first step, not least because it validates the arguments that national advocacy groups have been making for a long time. Finally, and certainly not least, there is need for an updated EU LTS. This would go a long way to creating an integrated EU vision for climate neutrality based on the national perspectives that exist. And if done right, and done with the right participatory channels, could reiterate the importance of robust long-term planning in advance of the scheduled LTS updates in a couple years' time. So thank you. That's all from my side, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very, very much, both Nick and Eike, and I hope that our audience and our experts appreciate that while this may have seemed sort of still quite long in terms of a presentation, the colleagues here have basically a 120-page report detailed that I think they have done an excellent job of condensing and presenting in both some of the specific examples with details, but also with the key messages from the analysis. And so against that backdrop, I think I now invite Gwenaëlle and Katharina and Alban to join me. So that we can pick up and discuss those. I'm suggesting that we start with our two representatives from the member state level. You know, after this presentation, Gwenaëlle, you know, now there is the one with the extra laurels. You know, we realize France is actually already in its second revision process, if I understand correctly. You know, the third version of the strategy is being prepared. So this whole notion of irregular updating is clearly something that you're taking seriously, and I think it shows the importance that you're giving to the strategy. So I would like to ask you to start by just explaining that a little bit and telling us about the role that the long-term strategy plays in the French national policy making context, and you know, to what extent you think it's actually been able to put your policy overall on track towards the long term.
Sure. Thank you, Matthias, and good afternoon to everyone. And well, thank you for this wonderful report. So yeah, in France, we have quite some experience with updating long-term strategies, since the first one we published was in 2015. And at the time, it was mainly, let's say, a bureaucratic sort of document that was mainly produced internally, and that didn't attract much of public attention at the time. And when we started revising the strategy in 2018, so the second strategy, it featured a much wider public consultation, and we had this challenge of reaching net zero for the first time. So there was a lot of work, and we needed a lot of information from different type of stakeholders, and it ended up with publishing detailed trajectories for each sectors. And it was very striking, the difference between the two strategies, since after the second strategy was revised, it had a very different dimension. For example, we had a climate law shortly after this, and all of the MEPs were asking, okay, but what is the link with the long-term strategy? To what extent this provision is aligned with what the long-term strategy is saying? So we really had a lot of demand from this side, and also with the trajectories that we published were starting to be used in very different places. For example, the firms that had received public support during COVID now have to publish GHG reduction strategies that are aligned with the long-term strategy. So we had to make additional publications to explain to them how they can align their own strategies with the national long-term strategy. So yeah, it really had a much more ownership in the various parts of society, and this I think was very, very helpful. And yeah, I think what helped the strategy to become really much of a reference is both the stakeholder consultation that really helped getting more ownership of the documents, and also having very detailed and quantified trajectories to help people putting figures behind the narrative, let's say. And yeah, as you say, now we are in the second revision of the strategy. And the main challenge is to introduce the Fit for 55 package and the changes that are being affected to the 2030 target, let's say. But also we need to incorporate all the new data that has been coming through, for example, in our forest sink that has been very quickly decreasing recently. So we have to incorporate this into having a better sense of what our 2050 neutrality vision is. yeah, some assumptions that were found to be over optimistic, for example, stuff like this. So a lot of work. We already have had 2 public consultations ongoing, one on more the climate part and one more on energy. And there will be a law next year in order to enshrine in the law the main, let's say, targets and orientations of the strategy, so that after this, the proper documents can be published. So both the long-term strategy, the more 2030 NECP-like documents. So yeah, we are in the middle of all this, so a lot of work going on. And very recently, we had announcements with the ecological planning, which is a new thing that the new government is very keen on working on, and they have created a general secretariat of ecological planning, which is placed right under the Prime Minister. And the role of this office is very much to formalize, let's say, the cross-government action toward reaching the long-term goals on climate, but also other environmental goals. So it's very recent, so I can't tell you much about this, but it's only, they have starting the work, and we hope it will help us to streamline even more the climate action across government.
Thank you so much, Joanel. So the strategy will actually be informing the legislation or the law that it is itself integrated in. That is super interesting. Also, that office that you mentioned, it goes to show, your I mean, for a reason. Also, our analysis picked up, that there are a lot of examples that can serve as good practice elsewhere. So. Seemingly, maybe you're not really looking for ways to improve, but I also take from it that things have been quite dynamic, and you've been sort of learning as you went along and adjusting the process and the input. And so against sort of that background, I want to see where you think the process overall, based on your experience, could be improved, and where maybe some of the findings and also the recommendations that were formulated in the presentation kind of ring a bell for you.
Yeah, indeed. When we did the second strategy in 2020, we really much focused on the 2050 point of climate neutrality, since it was sort of the new thing. And right now we are focusing much of our energy on the 2030 point, because I think it's both long-term and medium-term horizons require different sort of treatments. And for the 2030 points, really need to have very detailed roadmaps on the measures, on the finance, the investments required. So this is something we really try to give more details on. So that, for example, instead of discussing every year during the finance law whether we will increase funding for this program or another program, having sort of a multi-year financial planning that will help us to reach our targets for 2030. I think this is very much needed, and maybe for the longer term horizon you don't need the same, let's say, granularity. So yeah, I think this is something we really need to work more on. And yeah, as I was saying earlier, maybe like working more on the cross-government approach. I mean, now with the ecological planning, we are working very closely with other ministries, so to see what they need to do to get to our 2030 targets. So yeah, this is still ongoing, but yeah, very much agreeing with your recommendation. Maybe just underlying the fact that both the 2050 and 2030 horizons really much need to get hand in hand. And I think maybe in the European, let's say, processes, there has been a very big focus on the NECPs and 2030. But I think both visions need to go hand in hand because they inform each other, and it is very, very helpful for us.
Thank you very much indeed, and sort of happy for you to come back into the conversation. But let us go to Katharina. Thank you so much for coming and joining. And I know that the Joseph Stefan Institute, actually does support the Slovenian government in a whole variety of different types of inputs that the government needs, but also helps the government deliver on obligations that the country itself has under EU law, planning and reporting regarding climate, and both from the EU level and international level. And you yourself have been closely involved with the process of developing the long-term strategy. If I recall correctly, one of your roles was helping actually create the interface with other stakeholders, and in that function, I know that also you've been involved in exchanges with colleagues in other countries that have been working on long-term strategies. So, this is background that that I'm providing just to the audience so that they have a sense of where I think you're coming from. So my question then to you is, hearing the presentation by Eike and Nick and seeing sort of the insights, where can you identify with the findings in terms of the pluses and the minuses as well, and indeed also what do you make of the potential recommendations for improvement?
Thank you, Matthias, and thank you for the invitation. Perhaps at the beginning, if I just reflect a little bit how the Slovenian LTS was shaped, actually before the draft was shaped itself, we had a live project that lasted from 2017 and lasted for 4 years, and we were preparing at Josef Stefan Institute analytical basis for the LTS. And after that, actually, the Ministry of Environment actually asked us also to write a draft of the LTS. So I was also coordinating that. And also the same analysis was then used for the NSCP in Slovenia. So at least that was then in line. I mean, the numbers and everything is consistent. I mean, if I look at what were your suggestions, how this could improve? For instance, if I go about the template, why, for instance, some numbers are in the strategy, some numbers are not. I think it was also because each country kind of interprets the recommendation on its own. For instance, we had like the analytical data and annexes. Everything should be like the annex to the LTS, but at the end it wasn't. So at the end you had, for instance, just like indicated targets or goals or just some intervals, just because we think that what was, for instance, important, what came out of the document in Slovenia is that in 2017 or 2018, we already started to talk about the net zero to reaching climate neutrality, which I think for Slovenia at that time was already one step ahead of the people that were working at the ministries. If I look back, we had many workshops with stakeholders. This was within LIFE project. And we were discussing about reaching climate neutrality. And if I reflected now back, I had a feeling that they were not taking us seriously, for instance. I mean, not in that sense, but they didn't know what this will bring, how the climate crisis will actually evolve in, let's say, 2 or 3 years' time. And that's why perhaps also when you're saying about how LTS should have its position in the government and everything, for instance, in Slovenia, I would say it's kind of weak at the moment. There are preparations how to now to make a climate law and everything. But I think, for instance, in Slovenia, what should be good, or perhaps also recommendation for other countries, that LTS should be kind of intertwined with the general development strategy of the country. Because as I saw, it was like shaped, sometimes ministries are in silos, and also when you have, then when you're talking about reaching the targets and the goals, sometimes it's a feeling in Slovenia, for instance, that this is just a thing of the ministry. And when you were, for instance, also was one of your recommendations was to have like reviewing cycles and everything. I'm afraid that for a country as small as Slovenia, we're lacking the capacity. People's capacity at the ministries, for instance, and because now, for instance, we are also renewing the NSCPs. And again, for instance, a lot of also like experts are involved, and I'm not sure if we will have the capacity again to have people to update the whole strategy. I'm not saying just about to correct the goals or some things, but to do it again, I'm not sure we have enough capacity at the ministries. And then again, we were really lacking in Slovenia, it's on implementation. And then we will go again on this renewing cycle, updating cycle, and we will just be going through the processes again and again, but the implementation will be lacking and the time is running out. So this, for instance, and when I would just mention briefly the participation, public participation, we were doing it either also with live workshops, but these were more or less like experts. And then we also have public consultation within the LTS. But what actually happened was, okay, it was during the COVID times, but what happened that the draft that was published and that the final version, the end version, the government changed some things so drastically that it should be put again on the public consultation, but it wasn't. So this recommendation that you mentioned, like to have early, meaningful and interactive participation during the preparation, I would strongly agree on it as well. So it's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharina, and also for making the point about the capacity and just the effort required to undertake a detailed planning exercise. And if with that, since there were several references to the EU level and the impact of EU regulation, we go to Alban from DG Klima. I think I want to actually start introduction wise with highlighting, I think, one strategy that we haven't really mentioned yet, which is the Clean Planet for All communication that the European Commission actually published in, well, we have November, so what, 4 years ago now, at the end of November 2018, which was instrumental, of course, in putting the target of climate neutrality at the center of political attention, including it in the Green Deal and now in the European climate law, is to the merit and under the achievements of the current Commission. And so, we already heard how that is also influenced in a way what's been happening at the national level. But against that background and the positive impact that the EU LTS has, we now see on the basis of our analysis, at least, that there are many shortcomings in the national strategies that hamper their ability to inform policy. So my question to you is, what do you see from the perspective of DG Klima is the role of national long-term strategies in the overall context of EU climate policy, and how could they be strengthened?
Hi, Matthias. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'm here on behalf of my head of unit, Vicky Pollard, who couldn't join, unfortunately, but who still appears, I think, in the agenda. But okay, so on her behalf, again, I thank you for inviting us. I also thank you for the report, which will be a very interesting input in our own thinking on what to do next with regard to the national long-term strategies. I'd like also to thank you for reminding us about the 2018 EU long-term strategy document, which was really a milestone, we think, in terms of all-encompassing perspective with regard to climate policies and the completeness of the extension of the analytical coverage. Now, on the importance of national long-term strategy, I can only reiterate that we see this document as essential to help coordinate the EU, the overall EU level movement towards our collective climate neutrality by 2050. It's also an essential document to promote awareness and ownership for the different countries first, but also for actors within the countries and across countries of the transformation needs across sectors and across borders. So we really see this document as a key input to that transformation, to a real life transformation. Maybe just to say that the Commission has produced also its own assessment. I think you mentioned it briefly. A short assessment which describes, which summarizes the key features of the national long-term strategies. You can find this assessment in the latest edition of the Climate Action Progress Report, which just came out a few weeks ago. There was already a previous assessment in the 2021 edition, but I just invite you to have a look in case of interest. And you may also be interested in the summary tables or two-pager documents which have been uploaded in on our national long-term strategy website. These fiches were produced by our constructor, Ricardo, We also provide some kind of streamlined, organized analysis of the national long-term strategies as a complement to your report. So by and large, we share largely the findings of your own assessment. It's a start, so it's good as a start, but of course we could do better. As a process moves on in the future, and we will work to do better, of course. In general terms, we encourage member states to resubmit national long-term strategies, spurring for more comprehensive information in their strategies, notably on the quantitative information side. That's a very important element to then assemble this different kind of more bottom-up national level piece of information to a EU level aggregation. So this is one thing we encourage the countries to do. And we also encourage them, of course, to increase ambition where it is relevant and possible. The governance regulation provides for some kind of window, kind of formalized window for these resubmissions, which is early 2025, which sounds from a timeline perspective kind of suitable in the context of the NECP, the new NECP final submission by mid-2024. So there we see there's some kind of common time window to provide joint or integrated projections and documents. Yes, and on this specific aspect, this is something we think is very important. It's been stressed by Gwenaël and also by Katarina. We see great value in having integrated approaches between the NECPs and the national long-term strategies. So integrated from kind of policy, domain perspective, and ministries involved, and how to coordinate across services. And also integrated from a quantitative or really model-based projections perspective. We see clearly a value for the NECP process to factor into the extent possible, this long-term vision, this long-term transformation needs. Already, back in time to 2030 or around 2030. So this is a general message, and we think that it will improve the quality of the overall delivery across the board, of course. It will also help countries to build their own tools, we think, their own capacity to explore these questions in the coming years and decades. Yeah, so that would be my general comments. There've been already some couple of points on the governance regulation. I cannot really comment on that specific point, on a possible review, or when, to which extent, how, and so on. But nonetheless, I think we all see the governance regulation a bit as a kind of living material with potential for learning. I guess that applies to countries, but also to us. So we see the scope to improve things and keep this dialogue interface kind of up for improvements. But today I will be listening with great interest any good contributions or ideas in this respect. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Alban, for your response. I see currently, so there are many possible topics, but also if I'm connecting the dots between your three inputs here, I see on the one hand a topic I would like to follow up on is this integration between the near or mid-term and the longer term. The other one is you recommended that the capacity build up in member states, and Katarina mentioned that as a concern. And then we have amongst our Q&A we have also this question about the potential power or lack thereof of the Commission in terms of reacting to the strategies. And I'll actually take the segue from that last point and the power of the Commission and ask about the integration of NECPs and long-term strategies. Do you see any scope that both the attention and in terms of process that NECPs and long-term strategies could be treated more equally currently you were saying on the timing side, they seem to be close by. I would pose that maybe NECP is being updated in 2023 and 2024, and then LTS is being updated afterwards, sort of may also seem like it's the wrong way around. You're updating your short term first, and then you're looking at where that gets you to the long term, whereas maybe, you would want to do the backcasting and have current policy making be informed by the long term. And then there is the process issue. So the NECPs have this possibility of a draft being analyzed and assessed by the European Commission, and you then provide feedback on it. But this doesn't exist for the long-term strategies. So would you think there is some scope in also kind of aligning these processes and timelines more than they currently are?
Well, I think there will be some thinking on how to kind of a bit beef up, the role or the importance of the LTS in this overall setup. Of course, the NECPs will be about, time horizon of NECPs is aligned with, targets, sectoral targets, the actual policy framework or the proposed policy framework and so on. So it will remain, more extensive and more comprehensive in terms of coverage needs and granularity. But nonetheless, I think there will be some thinking and reflection on how to better connect or anchor the national long-term strategy to the NECP and make it the more important brick of his overall process.
Yeah. And maybe we can benefit to some extent from the French experience here. I think, Gwenaëlle, you mentioned how the different revisions have had a slightly different focus, but how are you in your current system dealing with the different timelines and slightly different treatment of these two planning tools, and how do you deal with that or compensate in terms of the alignment in France?
Yeah, I think the main answer to that is that we have only one common modeling exercise for both 2030 and 2050, and for both climate and energy. So around this big exercise, then we draw, let's say, threads on the specific topics that are of interest for us. So, for example, we'll have, as I said earlier, a different granularity between 2030 and 2050, and a different focus. We'll be much more focused on the measures and the investments to 2030, and to 2050, it's more like a description of the transitions that need to happen. So, yeah, I think with one exercise we can do both. I think this is where one way to overcome this sort of capacity shortages in member states. If it's only one exercise for both, you don't need to be constantly updating once the NECP and then the long-term strategy, and then you're always updating something. I think maybe this could be a useful way of doing it. And if I can maybe just reacted on your suggestion of the update of the governance regulation. At the time, France advocated for very strong provisions on long-term strategies on the governance regulation. So of course, I think we would support these updates. But I think what would be needed to get there is that we, through exchanging experience between member states, that we very much support member states to move from this box ticking, let's say, reporting burden exercise of having this LTS to something meaningful to them and useful to them. A bit like I was saying for France, on the difference between our first strategy and the second one. The first one was very much a reporting stuff, whereas the second ones were really helpful for our own domestic policy making. And I think once this shift is being made, I think there will be much more maturity to make updates to the governance regulation and to move to another dimension with the LTS in the future.
Thank you, Gwenaëlle. Katharina, I think that reminds me of you describing how, basically the ownership with the long-term strategy is basically with one ministry, and it's not seen as really an all of government priority. Is more attention from the EU level or an exchange between member states? Do you think that would somehow be helpful in this regard?
Yeah, I think it will be useful, but I think it also depends, at least in Slovenia, because we now it's political thing again, and we changed the government. So as I said, now they're also preparing again, getting really serious about the climate law and everything. And they are also even thinking of shifting the part that it's on Department of Ministry of Environment that is dealing with climate to the part that is also with the Ministry of the Energy, so that this will be the people who actually start to work together, because now the NSCP is prepared at one ministry and the LTS is prepared on another ministry. So I think we are already slowly making steps forward. And now recently, perhaps also the LTS is getting mentioned more and more, but still it's this, I don't know, probably because in France, I understood that you were doing this at the ministry, the modeling as well, because this could also be why it's there not so strong ownership, because a lot of work is actually outsourced on the research institution. So it's not that people are everyday hands-on on the ministry, on the document. So I think this could also increase the ownership of the document if you're working on it like intensively. On the substance, not just about on ticking the boxes.
Thank you, and that I think connects also again to the capacity question. So this from the integration to political attention to enhance integration, we're getting to the capacity. I mean, Katharina, you mentioned the LIFE project and the help that's provided. Also, the fact that you basically have been able to establish basically a common fact base for the different processes. So that's is an example, I think, of really useful direct EU level support to enhance these processes. Where do you think that member states such as Slovenia, could use additional guidance or support to improve the situation for them?
Oh, it's a tough question. I mean, I don't work at the ministry, but I'm thinking perhaps it could be on the capacity side. I don't know, even if it's exchange or some kind of technical help but it's then again, the question of the ownership, I think, becomes more, because, yeah, as we also see for some other practices is, if, as I said before, if people on the ministries are actually working on the topics, it's more like it becomes their own topic. It's not just that somebody from the outside comes and do the analysis or anything for them, but yeah, LIFE definitely helped, because we actually managed to create almost a community among ministries, and people start actually, now they know the faces with emails. It's not just the emails when you need some data or something, it's now people actually know each other. And I think that's why also our workshops were really successful. I mean, a lot of people, different people attended them, and actually some they start talking in person, not just like through emails. So some kind of that kind of projects, perhaps that it's not necessary live or something.
Thank you, Katharina. That so the importance of working through the process and the awareness raising function was also one that you mentioned, Alban. Maybe taking that point from on the potential for additional support or dialogue. The dialogue being also something that we mentioned. The NECPs, if I'm not mistaken, and as, of course this may be DG Ener and not DG Klima leading the exercise. I'm not entirely sure. Have been, I think, been given quite a bit of technical support and its own working group, etc. Do you see that there is scope to kind of raise a little bit the attention and the support levels for long-term strategies too?
Well, I take note of these ideas. We also see that capacity building is key. But some member states actually have that capacity, and the French experience is, from that perspective, is great. We are happy also that the LIFE project helped you, Katharina, to develop this capacity and build beyond the tools. Also build some kind of this community approach that you mentioned. Kind of cross services a bit approach. Yeah, again, I take note of his feedbacks and suggestions.
Thank you, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to so basically put you on the spot there in terms of expecting an immediate pledge for additional support. That was maybe poorly phrased on my part. Let's take then maybe the specific question that we got from the Bulgarian colleague in the Q&A earlier, who was asking about the ways in which the Commission will engage further with countries that that have either not submitted their strategies. I know that your basically infringement procedures have been started, but also where you know, the assessment, any kind of assessment that the Commission may still do, show that there is basically a long-term strategy that may not be fit for purpose. So is there any action you can take to well, require, encourage member states to resubmit or do a better job?
Look, we again, this is something we'll reflect upon. I cannot really comment there. We published, you know, these short assessment with these technical fiches there. Yeah, let's see how and how we move forward from there.
Yeah. Thank you. And I can say that we checked these summaries from Ricardo and colleagues thoroughly for each of the strategies that we analyzed. I also posted the link to that page earlier in the chat for everyone. It's a very useful resource for the community. Thank you for making those publicly available. I have two more now, I think 3 more questions I haven't fully digested. One that I'll pose first is, these are now 2 questions maybe that are going to our member state representatives for kind of the last you know, a couple of minutes. One is from Erica, who is also still going to have the chance for some closing remarks later on. But the question is, in principle, one of the values of the long-term strategies and the fact that they're looking at things in an integrated perspective at the whole economy across sectors should be able to identify, you know, interactions in the solutions or sequencing implications, you know, one sector having to do X so that another sector has the ability to decarbonize. And so are there any noteworthy revelations of that kind of source that you saw in the process that particularly surprised you or led to a change in policy? And I don't know, how, Gwenaëlle, would you like to start? Thank you.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I think this is a very good question. Maybe one concrete example that we had in France was so when we were doing all our modeling and everything, we noticed that the use of biomass in our scenario was exceeding the supply. So all the sectors were trying to decarbonize using biomass, and then we were, oh, but when we look at the production in the agriculture and forest sector, we noticed that there was a disconnect between these two. And then this leads us to to reconsider many assumptions that we were doing, and also to reconsider existing policy schemes. So for example, there were policy schemes that were subsidizing the use of biomass from the energy sector. And now we're trying to shift it more towards electrification and energy efficiency, so that we don't get locked in, processes where we use a lot of biomass and then making the constraints even stronger in the longer term. So this is, I think, a very concrete example on how, these two working on the two horizons at the same time can really feed into one another.
Thank you. Katharina, do you remember anything that would fit that bill?
Not at the moment, actually.
Thank you. Well, we will, so you definitely get another chance if something comes to mind. I then will actually go straight to the other question that's also directed specifically at 2 member state representatives here on the panel. The importance of the stakeholder consultations in the process. You both mentioned them, and this is from a colleague at E3G who asked if you could contextualize a bit more, what sense they were helpful for the process. Maybe Katharina, you want to go first here.
Yeah, I mean, I can say we had 2 types of consultations. I mean, one was within the LIFE project, which was more or less like just consultation with the expert, which actually help us to double check our models, our assumption in models. For instance, I don't know, discussing about the GDP, what to take, what kind of growth, do we have any kind of projections, discussing how to penetrate electric vehicles, discussing about how much renewables we can actually have by 2030, by 2050. So I think this was a really good it's a necessity that you need, that you have a look of your assumptions and what you're thinking with the experts and to discuss them. And then sometimes you get the information, okay, we cannot do this because we have this kind of, I don't know, regulations or whatever stuff can come up, or I don't know, people from biodiversity can have different views than people for renewables and that kind of stuff. So this actually helps you shape the scenarios. And then on the other hand, you have like a consultation with general public, which I think was important, or at least now it's important, because if we are going to shift to climate neutrality, this will be a whole shift. It's like the shift of the society. It's not just one strategy. And I think it's really important that you start engaging with people and discussing with people, explaining that, and the early stage, that at the end you don't get the yellow vest, sorry, or something like that, that will actually backfire if you do just something inside the four walls of the ministry.
Thank you very much. And Gwenelle, you, I mean, you know, basically put this at the kind of as one of the success factors for the whole process. So a brief response from you also.
Yeah, I could talk about this forever, but in a nutshell, so we have different sort of level of consultation. We have the phases where we consult the wider public, so through online surveys or things like this. And we did one pretty recently. I think it was helpful because it helped us in giving very large and overarching orientations. For example, there was we noticed through at the end of the consultation that there was a very big support for trajectories that put behavioral changes and sobriety with a big emphasis, unlike the use of unknown technologies, for example. So sort of these sort of wider orientations are helpful to us. And then we have another level, which is more expert consultation. So we have these like working groups at the sectoral level. And then it's very helpful to gather the academics, the NGOs, the private sector, and they help us by providing the assumptions that we put in our model, for example, to provide potential additional measures, the feasibility of options. And this is something that have been very helpful to us to also strengthen the scenarios that we are making. And in addition to all of this, there is also the usefulness that by getting them involved, they have more ownership and they know that this exists at all, and this is happening, and then they can also use it in their own work. So, for example, we have had recently a group of banks that used our scenarios for the building sector to use it for their own GHG strategy. So, both advantages.
Thank you very much. And maybe taking just at least a piece of the last question that we have open here and connecting it to the question of public participation. So Alban, you know, DG Klima has not formally got the requirement to update the EU long-term strategy. I mentioned it earlier, and the impulse, the important input into policy that it has already had. But you are now obviously having to prepare somewhat similar analysis, and your unit being responsible for this big task of putting forward a new 2040 target, an interim target in the Commission. So maybe in the context, you can speak to your plans for engaging, you know, the experts community and the public in this updating, and maybe if there is anything that you can say on possible. Is that the equivalent of updating the EU long-term strategy, or could that be a separate thing?
Yes, thanks, Matthias. Well, indeed, so the climate law is asking Commission to come up with so-called intermediate climate targets for 2040 by, at the latest, within 6 months of the global stocktake, which will take place in November 2023. So for next year's scope. So that brings us to, you know, the first half of 2024 for such a proposal. So we are now starting to prepare this work. There's been no decision when the proposal will actually be made, say, but we are aiming at having, you know, at beginning of 2024 as our kind of targeted timeline. The overall idea or logic follows a bit the 2030 climate target plan. in the sense that this proposal will focus really on GHG emission levels by 2040, without entering, post-2030 policy framework discussion. Okay, but eventually that proposal will then define the space for a future post-2030 policy framework discussion, which will come after 2024, of course. So that's this is how we are engaging on that work stream. In terms of content, so if you look or read carefully the climate law, you will see a long list of things to be assessed. And they are fairly close to what you can find either in the EU long-term strategy for 2050 or in the 2030 climate target plan. So it's likely that the impact assessment accompanying the proposal will share similarities with the 2030 CDP or the 2050 LTS. Yes.
And potential inputs or broader engagement around that. Is there anything you can say about that already?
Yeah, sorry, good point. So our idea is to launch a public consultation during the first quarter of next year, 2023. So, first quarter, it can be anywhere between January and March for the launch, but that's the plan, yes.
Thank you.
So in the first half of next year.
Yeah. So, it sounds like we can consider a little bit that process to be, the closest we may come to formal updating of the EU long-term strategy, and hopefully some of the insights from further conversations, this conversation, our input can help feed into the ways in which we consider, the setting of the next targets, the details that are going to be published around that in terms of the pathways and how we get there, and also how we engage between member states and the EU level better and even more in a more integrated fashion going forward. And I already, from my side, want to thank you very much for your inputs and for your feedback. There were a couple of topics that we didn't get to talk about anymore, for example, specifically considering the impact of the current crisis and how that is impacting the strategy is a very important topic. But we are about to run out of time, and so I want to make sure to hand over for closing remarks back to Erica Hope from ECF. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias, and thanks very much to the presenters and the panelists. That's been super interesting. I think it's great to have the detailed look at the content of the strategies from the ecologic colleagues, and then also the more kind of human, real-world experience of making and using the strategies from the country colleagues. I think what comes across really strongly is that there's a strong relation between the quality of the process and the quality of the document. And if you have a good process, then you're going to have a good document, and also if you have a good document, then people are going to be more likely to use it, and it's going to be better in the future. So it's a kind of ongoing cycle, I think. And the example Gwenaël mentioned about the biomass piece, I think, bravo to France for sort of identifying that and acting on it. And I suspect that may be the case for a lot of other countries as well. So it's important that we start to sort of surface these things and act on them. And I guess my last thought would just be, obviously, with the NECPs needing to be updated next year, I mean, back to the highway to hell, this decade is really critical, and we have to make the NECPs net zero compatible. And there's no way we can do that unless we understand the pathways out to the long-term target. And so countries, I would say, really should, and I hope will be able to take the opportunity next year to update the long-term strategies as well, hopefully with support and encouragement and backing from the Commission in terms of, the exchange support, potentially the updated governance regulation rules, and potentially also this work on its own long-term strategy that will, set an example and a framework for others to also refer to. So yeah, thanks very much for the report and for the excellent discussion.